At this time, I would like to formally begin today's conference and introduce Luke Hanna.
Yes, thank you, Eddie, and thank you all for joining us for this second environmental webinar sponsored by Annex 4. The topic of today's webinar is interactions of marine mammals and birds around marine energy devices. So as the marine energy industry continues to grow, it is imperative for the marine energy researchers, regulators, and developers to understand the range of potential interactions marine animals such as marine mammals, fish, and seabirds may have with these devices. However, monitoring marine animal interactions in proximity to marine energy devices can be very challenging and costly due to the high energy marine environment and limited time and weather windows. For this webinar, we will be joined by 3 scientists who have developed novel techniques and methodologies to monitor the interactions of marine animals in the wave and tidal energy sites. The research presented today has greatly contributed to enhancing our overall understanding of how marine animals may interact with wave and tidal energy devices, thus decreasing the level of uncertainty surrounding specific environmental interactions. We have 3 presenters from Scotland for this webinar. The first will be Ben Wilson from the Scottish Association of Marine Sciences. Ben is a principal investigator in marine mammalogy and marine renewables at SAMS in the UK. Ben's primary focuses are the fish and marine mammal predator-prey interface, population ecology and conservation, and examining the potential environmental impacts of marine renewable devices and marine fauna with an emphasis on the physical and acoustic interactions between marine vertebrates and tidal stream devices. Ben's presentation today will be titled Marine Mammals and Tidal Turbines, What are the Issues of Concern and How are they Resolved? After Ben, we will be hearing from Benjamin Wilson from the University of Aberdeen. Benjamin is currently a research fellow at the University of Aberdeen. He is currently working on the Flowback project, which aims to enhance our understanding of the environmental and ecological effects of marine energy devices. Specifically, he has designed and deployed a monitoring platform that uses multi-beam sonar and multi-frequency echo sounders to track birds, fish, and marine mammals during the course of their interactions with marine renewable energy devices. His presentation will be titled Using the Flowback Seabed Frame to Understand Underwater Interactions Between Diving Seabirds, Prey, Hydrodynamics, and MREDs. Finally, we'll be hearing from Beth Scott, also from the University of Aberdeen. Beth is a senior lecturer at the University of Aberdeen and focuses on multidisciplinary research that defines biological and physical variables that provide the limited, patchy locations and conditions where trophic energy is transferred across trophic levels in marine food webs. Beth will be presenting on a response project in which integrates at-sea distributional surveys with concurrent environmental data sets to identify the factors that drive populations' foraging distributions. Beth's presentation will be titled Predictable Fine-Scale Habitat Usage of Diving Seabirds in High-Energy Sites. With that, I'd like to thank you all for joining and thank the presenters, and I guess at this time we should give it over to Ben.
Thank you very much. I just wanted to kick off with the first slides, if those can come up. Excellent, thank you. Right, what I wanted to talk about is really a summary of the issues, and I'm speaking from the UK as part of 3 UK-Scottish presenters here, so I will be, my perspectives will be more or less as they are going on in the UK, but with a nod to other areas, particularly the US and Canada. So what I wanted to talk about is marine mammals and tidal turbines. What are the issues of concern and what work's going on? How are they being resolved at the moment? Where are we at the moment? And my co-authors are Gordon Hastie and Stephen Benjamins from the UK. As most people involved in the industry are aware, there's a vast menagerie of devices being progressed at this time, ranging from conceptual ideas, scale devices in people's back gardens or development university labs or whatever, through to test devices, to full-scale devices that are really being tested at sea. And there's well over 50 of those devices. There's something like 70 or so in different countries at stages. To generate realistic levels of power, we really need to be looking at hundreds of kilowatts up to megawatt-sized turbines spaced as arrays wired up to the grid to be a commercial entity. And at the moment, we may not be there. That level of many, many turbines is a conceptual something for the future, but in actual fact, we are looking at small arrays in the immediate future. For example, in the UK, there's a development called Maygen, which has consent to develop and is looking to develop at least 4 turbines in the absolute near future. However, to go from this kind of a few turbines up to the full-scale commercial reality of many turbines, we're going to need better information on issues to do with potential environmental impacts. And one of those is undoubtedly the issues to do with marine mammals and tidal turbines. Now, as we know, tidal energy isn't a ubiquitous resource. It's not everywhere. It tends to be focused on particular places. So, for example, around headlands, where water is concentrated moving past a headland, is an area of interest. Similarly, between islands and, say, a mainland shore where water is channeled through, and also in entrances to inner waterways or sounds between larger pieces of landmass concentrate tides. And there are many, many examples of sites like this scattered around the world. And we also know that these areas are also disproportionately of interest to marine mammals, not only because the increased energy and productivity of these sites may attract marine mammals, but also they're of value for animals going somewhere else, for example. So they are a means to an end to go somewhere else as a passageway. In addition, these are sites that we actually know relatively little about in oceanographic terms or in marine mammal terms, simply because these are difficult places to work. The large amount of energy make the usual tools that we'd work in these areas challenging. So as a result, we know relatively little at this point in time about how marine mammals use these sites and what are the factors that drive that attraction, and we'll hear more about that in the next 2 talks. So in terms of tidal turbines or turbines, what are the issues? Well, there are a series of issues from the initial construction and maintenance of devices. So how do you put them in? You might use techniques such as pile driving. How do you connect them up? What are you going to do with cables, trenching, and so on? And then how do you maintain them when they're in the air? Would you lift the devices out, or how are you going to maintain them, and what tools do you use? So there are issues which are in common with other industrial activities: pile driving, trenching, maintenance boats, and so on. So these are not issues that are unique to tidal turbines. For operation, though, issues tend to be more specific and much less known at this point in time, simply because these technologies are new to us. Moving from the probably less significant, there are things like chemical pollution. How are these devices going to be anti-fouled for long-term duration rather than the sort of experimental type deployments that we've seen so far? What lubricants are going to be in them? But generally, given the rate of flow and the small amounts of lubricants and so on, these are not going to be, well, we suspect at this point, massive issues. Operational noise is less well known at this point in time, mostly because these devices are new. And then moving on to the more generic ones, what level of spatial displacement do we see? Do we see avoidance of the area simply because of the presence of these devices or their operation? Does that avoidance lead to some sort of barrier effect and animals not using the site or having to go round the site? Or conversely, are they attractive in some way and change spatial usage because of their attraction? And finally, and for us, the big one so far has been, well, what happens if animals actually collide with devices? Is it going to lead to injury or some other effect? And certainly in the UK, from the consenting side, the issue of collisions is a potential showstopper to further development, depending on magnitude and what are the implications. Now, we have several turbines in operation in the UK. The largest and the longest running arguably has been the CGen device in Strangford Lough in Northern Ireland. And there have been a number of efforts by SMRU Marine, Royal Haskoning to try and understand, to investigate the collision issue, or certainly the near approach of animals. However, amongst the consenting issues has been not to allow the turbine to turn when there are animals known to be in the area, with observers on the top with a big stop button if they see animals. And then latterly a sonar system performing a similar function. And that stipulation has been allowed to be relaxed for a genuine turning of the turbine when there's animals known to be in place. That hasn't happened yet, so we don't know what the results are. But however, that's been probably the closest we've become. But at this point, we don't yet know whether collisions are going to be a concern or not, or reality or otherwise. And so as a result, there's been a wide range of research projects in the UK and further afield to try and get at that. And so what I wanted to do with the remainder of this talk was to look at who's doing what to give an idea and where they fit into the overall picture. And as I see it, there are 5 areas of research investigation to understand the problem of collisions in tidal. So those 5 are, firstly, to look at which species are at risk and how many. If animals are in the area, what is the probability of a strike actually occurring? So an animal's colliding with a turbine versus missing it versus dodging around it, or close range avoidance, something called evasion, or wider scale avoidance of the device. Do collisions actually occur? So there's all this interest in whether they occur, but is it reality? Fourthly, if they do occur, what are the consequences? Is the animal simply swim away with a bruise and a story to tell? Is it stunned, or is it actually mortally wounded by the interaction? And finally, are there any mitigation options? Is there any way to fix the problem should it exist? So those are the 5 areas, and what I'm just going to do is summarize the efforts that have been going on. I do recognize there are other efforts elsewhere, but here are some examples. Okay, so which species are at risk and how many? Certainly for pre-consenting and area evaluation, there are a large number of surveys of various different descriptions gone on to work out which species are in the area and how many there are. Shipboard surveys or aerial surveys, for example. So application of existing techniques. There are also been adaptations of existing techniques specific to working in tidal areas and issues to do with the flow. So, for example, taking normally moored passive acoustic monitoring equipment and letting it drift through the tidal race to map out where animals are detected. So it's an adaptation of existing technique. There's been others. There's development of new moorings and techniques specific for tidal areas. So UW's developed a sophisticated lander with carrying existing and new tools on it. Not only to look at which animals are in the area, but also where are they in the water column. So, for example, there have been efforts to use telemetry devices, so you put on pinnipeds, for example, to look at where are they in the water column, and really specifically trying to get at the resolution relevant to these sites, because most of them tend to be quite small relative to other sites normally looked at. But also for animals that you can't put tags on, there have been efforts to try and get at using, say, passive acoustics to localize animals in 3D. So Jonathan Gordon and others at SMRU have been developing vertical arrays that you can hang from boats or from drifters to localize using the acoustics where animals might be in the water column vertically. And that gives an idea about what the spatial extent of overlap might be between turbine blades and water. Right. The second area is what is the probability of a strike actually occurring. So we've got an idea of how many animals in the area. So what? Okay, what's the probability? So what is the probability of an animal moving through the swept area of the blade and just simply missing the blades and actually colliding with it? And this is strong parallels to the bird wind turbine interactions that have been studied more broadly. And accordingly, there's a series of encounter rate or collision risk models developed. In the UK, we've been using 4 different varieties of these models, but they're basically looking at what is the probability of an animal if it doesn't respond to the turbine simply being in the wrong place at the wrong time relative to the turbine blade. So there are a series of these models. Bob Batty, Bill Band, RPS Consultancy, and Marine Science Scotland have developed varieties of these models, and even though the methods to get there may be very different, the results are fairly similar. But they're giving us an idea of is this an issue to be concerned about, or is it such a rarity that it's not something that's going to happen very commonly? And conversely, it gives us an idea about if we are monitoring such an event, how frequently might it occur for us to actually observe it from a scientific point of view. So that gives us an idea about statistical power for picking up something. And then there are we've got these models that give us an idea of how frequently they occur, but these have been moderated by animal behavior themselves. Animals either dodging the blade, something called evasion, or steering around it at a wider scale, something called avoidance. And there are a number of ways to get at this. So, for example, there's a consultancy called Xi Engineering who've been looking at trying to calculate how loud a turbine might be, so that gives us an idea of at what range an animal can avoid a turbine, i.e. it can perceive it and then take avoiding. And then there's been attempts to actually map the acoustic emissions from turbines against background sound by ourselves at SAMS and others. And then there have been some experiments doing playbacks of simulated sound to animals, either instrumented wild animals with telemetry transmitters or simply animals in the wild to get an idea of their responses. And there have been a number of attempts to use sonar to get an idea about close range interactions. Sonar wouldn't be so good for wider scale avoidance, but it will give us an idea about close scale avoidance or evasion. And we're going to hear more about that. Moving on to the third area, do collisions actually occur? And this is an area of increasing interest. It's really shooting up the agenda of importance. So as I mentioned, you could use high-resolution sonar to get an idea of animals within the vicinity of the turbine blades. You could use optical cameras to do the same, or you can instrument the turbines themselves with accelerometers or strain gauges, or indeed microphones. Some instrumentation on the blades to try and pick up an actual strike. And Brian Pelagi and others at UW are developing something they call the AMP, which is trying to give us some of these perspectives by really looking at close range at an operating turbine. But I'd argue at this point in time we don't yet have an operational collisionometer, something to actually detect to a degree of accuracy whether collisions are actually occurring or not. So this is an area we really do have to nail down in the near future. And one of the issues is to try and figure out how big a signal an animal connecting with a turbine would actually give us if we were going to use strain gauges, microphones, accelerometers, or others. And there's some modelling going on at the University of Manchester in the UK, more or less more from an engineering point of view, to ask the question, would a marine mammal strike with a turbine actually break a turbine? But we can turn that around the other way and give us an idea of what the signal to detect might be. And for that experiment, they're using scale models of minke whales and basking sharks in flume tanks with appropriately scaled turbines and instrumented turbines. But that's a flume study type experiment. And then moving on to the fourth area, if a collision was to occur, what are the consequences? I said the animal might move away with a bruise and a story, or nothing at all. It might be stunned, or it might be mortally injured. And at this point, this is again an open question. Thomas Carlson and others in the Pacific Northwest have been looking at if a killer whale were to interact with an open hydro device, what would be the injuries. For open-bladed turbines, we know less. Dave Thompson at SMRU has been, I've got a crash test picture here, but he's hoping to look at what would be the consequences of a open-bladed blade strike and pinnipeds, for example, on inner body injuries. And there are a variety of pathologists interested, not only for what are the injuries be, but if you're doing a necropsy on a stranded animal, what are the signs you'd be looking for in that carcass to be able to establish whether a stranding was associated with a turbine strike or not. And there's two ways of looking at this. One is to try to tie down whether an animal results from a strike, but conversely, when there's a stranding and there's, say, media interest or other interest in a strike, or media interest in a stranding, whether you can definitively say, well, that didn't originate from a turbine. And then there's other approaches to look at where might these strandings occur, and what's a credible area for strandings to occur. So, for example, here at SAMS, Mike Beddington's doing a PhD looking with the latest oceanographic modelling to look at what is the probable, in a probabilistic sense, where might strandings occur or where might they not occur. So finally, if strikes occur, what are our options for mitigating them? And several have been proposed and several are being progressed at this time. One obvious one is to avoid bad places for turbines themselves. There have been some instances of this in the UK, but many of the areas where of interest to tidal turbines are also used by marine mammals. Another one would be to erect physical barriers around turbines, and that's often brought up by the media and the public. In actual fact, there's often many challenges, and particularly if you're interested in things like seal pups, which are relatively small, or even things like migratory salmon, which is a big issue in many places. But that is a possibility that may or may not prove its worth. It certainly hasn't been investigated to its maximum. There are other issues, things like reducing tip speed is a possibility. Again, that has big implications for power takeoff and the resource. But if collisions were such an issue, it might be worth looking at, because that would obviously feed back into what are the consequences to the animal, and so on and so on. Another one is to have some active detection and stopping, much like the CGN activities in Strangford Loch. You could do that with sonar, as I discussed earlier, or you could use some passive acoustic detection, for example, for marine mammals, but obviously it would have limitations for things like basking sharks, turtles, and other megafauna. And then you could actually add some noise to the turbines if they weren't loud enough. You could add something like acoustic warning, as is the case for fisheries mitigation. But acoustic warning may have all sorts of other unintended consequences. So in this example, here we have a series of turbines in an array, and a dolphin, for example, that might be detecting the animals based on their acoustic footprint and swimming through the array to avoid turbines. You might want to reduce the amount of swimming through the array of turbines and get the animal to go around the array, which would obviously impact the potential collision rate. So if you increase the acoustic footprint of the turbines like this, you might well end up with some unintended consequences of animals actually avoiding the whole area, and then into barrier effects and so on. So I think acoustic warning should be approached with some caution at this stage until we understand the problem itself in more detail. So the take-homes I wanted to get across from this sort of mini presentation were, I think mammal turbine collisions are a potential showstopper for many areas, and particularly their protected status. as a result of this new technology, there are many efforts on different aspects of the problem to try and get a hold of what the issue before we move into moving turbines into the sea. But we are going to have to do that in order to understand the problem for real. We can't do everything in the lab. Documenting actual strikes is a fundamentally under progressed issue, and that's really going to be one of the areas we need to work on in future. And mitigation, there are mitigation possibilities, but I think we need to know whether there really is a collision problem before we go into actually mitigating. And with that, I'd like to finish and thank certainly the funders and collaborators that I've been working on to get where we are.
Overview of the research in that area. Right now, I'd like to introduce Benjamin Williamson from University of Aberdeen. He will be presenting next, and I just want to remind you all that we will be having the presenters go through the presentations one by one in the beginning and then addressing questions at the end. So any questions that you have, please enter them in the top right notes transcript field of the webinar. Thank you. Benjamin?
Great, thank you. Can you hear me okay?
Yep, hear you loud and clear.
Okay, and hopefully you can all see the slides. So thanks very much to Luke and to Annex 4 for the invitation to present here. What I'd like to talk about is the flowback seabed frame and using it as a tool to understand underwater interactions between diving seabirds, prey, hydrodynamics, and marine renewable energy devices. So the flowback project's a consortium of several UK institutions, and the work in developing and deploying and analysing the data from this is the contribution of many people across the UK. So I'd like to thank the co-authors listed here. The platform itself, you can see it on the right-hand side of the first slide. It's a seabed platform that monitors the entire water column. So we're looking at plankton, fish, seabirds, and marine mammals, so across all trophic levels. And we can capture the movements, behaviour, and interactions of these larger targets with marine renewable energy devices. The platform is self-contained, which means no cables, no anchors, and no infrastructure to install, which makes it portable between sites. So this is really useful for pre-construction monitoring, for monitoring adjacent to a device and then further away to look at some of the effects of device presence. And it continuously samples a spring-neap 2-week period at a resolution of several measurements a second. Data from the seabed platform is complemented by hydrodynamic model data and above-water radar data, which is looking at surface targets and surface features, so primarily birds being tracked on the water surface, that we can then try and match up with birds that we're seeing subsea and match up with prey underwater as well. Also, for the first deployments that we've carried out, we've had shore-based bird observations and wildlife observations as well, looking at the exact area of the water surface above the frame to look at ground truthing some of the acoustic observations. We'll come back to that in a minute. And I think what's most important at this kind of fledgling stage of monitoring is that it's field proven. We've had 5 2-week deployments at the EMEC, wave, and tidal test sites in Orkney in the UK, both adjacent to tidal energy structures and further away, at tidally influenced areas as a wave site and non-tidally. So we'll come on to some example results a little bit later on. The platform itself is shown on the left-hand side during a recovery. It combines and synchronizes a number of different instruments to pick up all these different physical and multi-trophic levels. So first of all, we have a Simrad EK60 echo sounder. So I'm not sure if you can see my mouse pointer, but hopefully you'll see it's these 3 purple cones pinging from the seabed all the way through the water column up to the water surface. We can use this to look at bird and fish abundance, school behavior. We can look at the frequency response between these 3 different frequencies to guide target identification, and also look at the morphology of turbulence, which we think is very important for foraging in these sites. We can also pick up plankton on this device. So we synchronize this multi-frequency echo sounder with an Imagenics multi-beam sonar. So that's this green swath here. The lowest beams ping along the seabed, all the way through the water column up to the water surface. And this pings at several frames per second, so it gives you almost like underwater video. we can use this high update rate to look at the interactions of fish, diving seabirds, and potentially marine mammals with marine renewable energy devices, looking at things like target tracking and potentially avoidance or evasion behavior. We deploy the whole platform within about 20 to 50 meters of a tidal turbine structure. So we're not directly in the turbulent wake of the structure. We're far enough away that we can be looking at the device from afar to be able to pick up the entire device and the surrounding water column in the multi-beam swath. We also have an ADV, which gives us local current measurements on the frame, and a fluorometer as well, which measures chlorophyll. So we're using this as a proxy for phytoplankton. So when we synchronize all of these different instruments, we pick up pretty incredible data sets. We'll have a look at some example ones now. On the left, you can see the multi-beam being used for target tracking. So here on the seabed, we see a tidal turbine structure, and then further up in the water column, we see this large target tracked through time. So the color shows time from blue, which was about 7 seconds ago in this case, as the target, what we think is a marine mammal, swimming through the multi-beam swath, to red here. So you can see the kind of resolution that we can track these targets with. This was gathered at the EMEC tidal energy site. If we now switch to the EMEC wave energy site, so still in Orkney in Scotland, but now we're looking at the UK60. Again, the seabed's down here at the bottom of the frame, and the water surface is at the top. But now the x-axis shows time, and this is a 9-minute excerpt from the wave energy site. So when you see a return in the water column, it's something that was persistent over the frame in time. And what we're looking at here is a large school of fish near the sea surface. And what's really exciting is these targets beneath, diving down underneath and feeding on the fish school. So we know from our shore-based bird observations at this moment in time that these are guillemots and razorbills feeding on the fish school. So what's really exciting is that we can look at predator-prey interactions over time, how these change around wave and tidal energy sites, how these might be affected by marine renewable energy devices, and how we can start to try and look at mitigating these. So as I've said, the ground truthing from shore observations is very important. Once we go to target tracking on the multi-beam, now we're looking at the Atlantis turbine structure, again at the EMEC tidal site. You can see the full turbine here on the bottom right-hand side. So this is what you're looking at on the multi-beam, except that on each of the legs there's about a 4 meter by 4 meter ballast block, a concrete ballast block. So if you look up on the left-hand side here, we see the central piling here, this 10 meter high piling. And this is one of the tripod legs of the base. The data we gathered here was just the turbine structure, the piling, but there was no nacelle and no blades present on it during this deployment. So the dashed green lines up here show to scale the expected blade radius. What the data that we'll look at here is just for the turbine structure. So we can see in red a large fish school picked up on the multi-beam. We can then look at the same return on the UK60 and look at the multi-frequency response to try and guide the species identification of the fish school. We can then perform target tracking. So again, we're looking from purple through to red as the target swims across the frame. We can look at how the behavior of the targets are changing as they encounter and perceive the turbine structure. We can look at things like packing density of the schools, target speed, target directionality. Later on, as we come to some of the more mobile targets as well, we can look at how the behavior is changing around the device. And finally, we mentioned multi-frequency analysis. So down on the right-hand side, we show an example for a school of mackerel, and that's using this distinct difference in frequency across 38, 120, and 200 kilohertz on the UK60 to try and ID the species. We heard a little bit before about using target vertical distribution to try and assess collision risk. So how many targets are we seeing throughout the water column? What percentage of targets are likely to be at a depth where they'll encounter either a turbine structure or the rotor swept area? So we can get an idea of how many animals of each species are in this part of the water column, at what stage is the tide, and then we can feed this into models to try and look at what chances there of a collision or evasion. The graph we're seeing on the right-hand side here shows all tracked targets using the multi-beam for a 2-week deployment next to the Atlantis turbine structure. So we've got the seabirds down here at the bottom, coming up to the water surface, in this case about 32 meters above the flowback frame. And these blue bars here show the vertical distribution of targets. So at the moment this is mammals, birds, fish schools, individual fish. About 4,000 targets tracked over the 2-week period. And we see that there's a strong bias of targets towards the water surface. We see the same at wave energy sites as well, so important where they'll be likely to encounter wave energy devices. But if we zoom in on this lower part of the water column, then we see that there's still a large number of targets at the height where they'll overlap with either the turbine structure or the rotor swapped area. So again, this is for all targets over the 2-week period. The next step is to narrow this down and to start to classify the targets. So hopefully you can see these 4 different example targets here. This gives you just an idea of the kind of data quality that we're picking up from the multibeam. Deliberately picked to be a low-budget, low-power consumption multibeam, accepting a slightly lower data quality, but it allows you to have a power and a data budget that's capable of sitting onto a self-contained platform. So we see at the top left a large fish school, persistent for several seconds throughout the multibeam site. And we see a smaller school on the bottom left. At the top right, a single target. So this is what larger solitary fish swimming through the site will appear as. Or for a larger target, potentially marine mammals. And then at the bottom right, a diving bird, again shown as persistent over several seconds. And here we're seeing partly the bird as it swims through the water column, but partly also the bubble trail that these birds are leaving behind. So we can take each one of these different classes, trying to get down to a level of at least target categories, but eventually, hopefully, down to species of concern, and look at the vertical distribution of these over a 2-week period, and how this changes around marine renewable devices or in areas free from marine devices, but under similar conditions at the wave and tidal sites. So we see the flowback platform as just one part of the jigsaw, as the complement of the overall monitoring that we can perform in these sites. It's got a number of benefits. The acoustics gives us a high range, so we can see all the way from the seabed right up to the water surface. But also we can deploy up to about 50 meters away from a turbine structure. So we've got good range and we've got good detection of all of the targets we've talked about before. It's important that this is independent of visibility and illumination. So at UK sites, certainly, the visibility is very, very poor, particularly at the Annex site. It's down to just a few meters from our experience with ROVs up there. We can gather this acoustic data throughout all hours of the day. And again, at the Annex site, as many of you will know, in the wintertime, we've got very few hours of daylight. So we're not having to install illumination for optical cameras and potentially risk disturbing our targets from that. We can gather data throughout the hours of darkness, and we see a lot of fish presence throughout the night. Also, we've got small data volumes. So the raw multibeam data is approximately 6 gigabytes a day, and that's 8 pings a second, continuously recording 24/7. So we're not limited by data storage. It's a low-power platform. We've specifically selected the instruments and the ping rates to be able to create a self-contained platform that can run off batteries for 2 weeks at a time. We can recover the platform in about a 20-minute slack tide window. So again, important for some of the UK sites. We take it back to shore, recharge the batteries overnight, and then we redeploy the following day at slack water. So we've built it around a 2-week deployment, a very short service window, and then redeployment to capture the closest conditions that we can in terms of ecological activity and weather conditions and site conditions for comparison between control and active devices. And also, we spent quite a long time working on the algorithms for target detection, target classification, target tracking around these devices. These algorithms are all real-time processing feasible. At the moment, the processing is done afterwards, and the results you've seen at the moment are all from post-processing. But with the computing power and the battery power that we've got on board, it's feasible to implement this in real time. That becomes important in a minute. So although there's a lot of benefits, the reason why we see it fitting into a larger monitoring approach is that there's limited detail for species identification. You'll have seen from some of the multibeam work, yes, we can try and ground truth it from either shore-based bird observations, from shore-based radar, offering the multi-frequency response. But in terms of picking out marine mammal species particularly, there's very, very limited detail. Also, observation of the final interaction, the final meter as the target potentially approaches a turbine structure or turbine blades, and assessing whether there was a collision, what was the severity of a collision. We don't think that's possible with the multi-beam setup that we've got at the moment. So we can't assess whether there was an actual collision, and also what was the effect of the collision. We're only looking at one side of the turbine. There's the potential to look at both sides with synchronized platforms, so you can see targets swimming in and then hopefully actively swimming back out the other side. But what we don't know is the later effects of the collision, as Ben was talking about previously. And then finally, an often cited limitation of active acoustics is there any behavioral response? We've chosen the frequencies, particularly the multi-beam, specifically to try and avoid this as part of the licensing. We know of work performed around the UK and worldwide, particularly the work from Gordon Hasty at St Andrews, looking at the lower frequency components of multi-beams and whether there's any effects on particularly marine mammals. So we need to bear this in mind. The flowback platform as it stands gives us an option to duty cycle the various different frequencies, the various different instruments. So we can either passively just turn on or off for example, one 12-hour tidal cycle for one daylight period, different frequencies, and see whether there's any effect seen on the other frequencies of target distribution and target behavior. So we can go some way to proving that there's no behavior response to the acoustics, but we see a potential solution to some of these limitations as multi-instrument integration. From discussions with the group at Washington and with the group at St Andrews and other groups worldwide, this seems to be where everyone's converging, trying to take the field-proven instruments that we've already demonstrated for target tracking and target identification around these devices, but integrate them. So on the right-hand side, we see a schematic which tries to show that we're looking at intelligent triggering of instruments across multiple scales. So first of all, at the highest radius, the highest range, we're looking at things like passive acoustics. First of all, for detection of vocalizing marine mammals or active tags, and then for localization. Then we can use this to trigger the multi-beam. So we're coming down one scale level, but increasing in detail level. So look at behavior and fine-scale interactions with turbine structures. Coming down one more scale level to the EK60, which gives us just an upward-facing beam to look at abundance and multi-frequency ID. And then finally, for the final assessment of interaction and hopefully species identification, looking at cameras, either mounted on something like the flowback platform, standing off from the device, but more likely in areas of low visibility, actually on the turbine structure, on the cell itself. An often cited limitation of cameras is the sheer volume of data that you get out of it. But what we see is using these different approaches, these different monitoring methodologies, we can trigger the various instruments to only be recording at the highest data rates when it's absolutely needed, when the target's been detected within the range of the finer scale instruments. So this reduces data processing that needs to be performed on board a self-contained platform. It also reduces data archival as well. As we mentioned before, we can cycle periods of the different acoustic frequencies to look at any behavior response, but also passive acoustics and active acoustics with this wider integrated platform. And these are passive acoustic receivers either mounted on the flowback platform or a wider array around the sites to increase the baseline. So in summary, where we've got to at the moment with the flowback platform, we've got 5 two-week deployments around wave and tidal sites, and we're investigating the ecological effects of both installing and operating marine renewable energy devices. We can determine collision risk probabilities from where the animals are in the water column, how they're using the different states of the tide, and how they're using these different wave and tidal energy sites. We can define vertical habitat use down to target categories, and any changes in habitat use, pre- and post-installation for this range of species. These results together across the multiple physical and multiple trophic levels increase our overall environmental understanding of mobile animal use of these high-energy sites. We can use these results to inform marine spatial planning, device design, licensing, and operation. Both as these individual devices are scaled up to arrays and new sites are selected around the UK and worldwide. We can try and use these results to increase the predictive power to eventually be able to reduce monitoring. So with the complete suite of flowback instruments and the wider monitoring that we've discussed, we can get a greater understanding of what the animals are doing in these sites, to eventually be able to deploy a monitoring, perhaps a post-deployment monitoring platform. It uses just a reduced monitoring suite, perhaps just a multi-beam, perhaps just passive acoustics, to just monitor what we've understood from the flowback project continues to be true to investigate different sites. I'd like to thank my co-authors particularly, and our collaborators around the UK as part of the flowback project, and the sponsors of the project as well. And I look forward to a discussion later on. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for that, Benjamin. That was very interesting work with the flowback research you guys are doing. So next up we have Beth. Next up we have Beth Scott presenting, and I just want to remind you before she starts, if you could all please post your questions now that we have time before the last presenter, because as I mentioned before, we will be addressing the questions after all three presentations. Thank you. Beth?
Okay, can you hear me and see my slides?
Yes, we can, Beth.
Okay, great. Okay, I first want to make this clear. What I'm presenting here today is from the other project the university is involved in, the RESPONSE project, another large NERC and DEFRA-funded project, and that this is the slides you're seeing and the analysis has all been done by the PhD on this project, James Waggett, who unfortunately couldn't be here today to present this, so I'm getting this honor. So what we want to talk to you about then is the stuff we've done above water, basically. So again, this is at the EMAC sites up in Orkney in Scotland. And here what we're trying to do is basically predict the fine-scale habitat usage of diving seabirds in these really high-energy sites. So basically, as you heard from Ben Wilson, same with seabirds, really we don't know what's going to happen when these tidal stream devices go in. It's very unknown exactly what these birds actually do underwater. So again, here we need to qualify the risks, collision risks in particular, between deep diving seabirds, and really start to prioritize actually what we should be studying. We know less about them than we do actually some of the mammals. So one of the ways to do it is to estimate the spatial overlap, which is this essential way of realizing whether there's collision risk or not. And that means, are the birds actually going to be right in the location where the turbines are? Are they actually going to dive where the blades are turning? And so to do that, what we're trying to do is predict where seabird foraging is actually going on within these high energy areas. So what we've done is basically using the area, it's called the Fall of Warness up in the Orkneys, and hopefully you can see the picture here that shows very, very strong tidal flows through this area, with the flows on the flood going to the south and when it's ebbing going to the north. And what you're seeing in these colored pictures first up at the top here is very, very fine bathymetry that we have of the depth, but also the more blue and yellow one I'm pointing at is the slope, where we have this sort of this big hole, this teardrop hole in the middle of this location that's probably been dug out by the tides coming through. What we also have from instruments, acoustic instruments on the boats we've used is a seabed roughness and hardness, looking at the different types. So we have all this bathymetry and bottom information to work with in terms of defining habitat. And then what we also are looking at is all the temporal changes in these habitats to do with ebb and flood cycles. So what you see here in the rows, we have ebb on the left and flood on the right, and then there's three different types of characteristics of the habitat. So something we're calling upwelling, meaning where the water is being forced in an upward position, that's the red colors. When it's being forced in a downward position, downwelling, it's in the blue colors, and showing the differences between ebb and flood. The second panel of pictures is showing turbulence, where you have really high levels of turbulence that seem to be coming off of topography. It's called the muckle green on this side, and the black of the island of Ede. And you see these high levels of turbulence, but they're quite asymmetrical. They're quite different in ebb and flood. And then in the bottom panels, we're looking at the speed of the tides. And as you can see, our ebb tides are actually quite a lot faster than our flood tides. And this kind of really detailed information is coming from the output of what we call FVCOM, a 3D hydrodynamic model from our colleagues in Plymouth who have given us this output using the very fine scale, less than meter bathymetry to drive this model. And we've compared these outputs actually with the radar that Benjamin mentioned in his talk at this site to actually confirm that these indeed do match up. So what we also want to look at is the temporal aspects of neap versus spring, as these areas in their spring tides get up over 4 meters per second, but in the neap tides sometimes don't get much over 2 and a bit. And what you see there is indeed, so this is looking just at the ebb tides now, but first on the left-hand side in the neap, and then on the right-hand side in the spring, and looking at the same 3 habitat variables. And what you see is indeed there is quite a difference. And in fact, spatially, it's quite interesting. There is more of a difference in where the upwelling and downwelling are, and that becomes a little bit more important later. So trying to understand then where, and being able to predict really where seabirds are actually foraging, what we're trying to say is we probably put the hypothesis out that seabirds associate with physical conditions, and these conditions promote prey availability. So this idea that possibly the types of turbulence, the kinds of habitats we were just talking about, the upwelling sites, actually increase prey availability, and you know, that they're somehow making fish more able to be caught by birds, which is why the birds are in these areas in the first place. That what James has said here is that prey availability is difficult to collect. Well, we do have prey information from our EK60s on the boat that we were using. It's the Marine Scotland Science boat that has the same EK60 that we've used on the flowback upward facing mooring. We use it downward facing, but running a boat across is not the same as putting a flowback mooring down, and basically we're taking a little bit longer to get rid of the turbulence out of those signals so that we can actually see the prey signal coming through in that. So we will have actual real prey signal at some point, but at this point what we thought we'd go ahead and we'd just try and see, because a lot of places won't have that kind of beautiful EK60 data to play with, can we just use physical habitat characteristics? So essentially what we're saying is that we think that where we see the presence of foraging seabirds, where we see them, and that we're assuming that there must be enhanced prey availability or catchability in these places. And therefore, we're going to look at the physical conditions in these areas from those habitat variables we've shown you and see if we can predict the foraging distributions of these birds. So what we've done is over 2 years now, 2 times in May and 2 times in October in the years of 2012 and 13, we've managed 103 transects. And by transects, what I mean is you see the zigzag color image. Basically, what we did is use that same transect line as much as we could and go against the tide, depending on which way the tide was flooding, so that we could continuously monitor at about 8 knots in these areas so that we could keep the boat steady, and that always the water was coming past us so that we weren't recounting animals. So it says here only seabirds upon the sea were recorded, so we weren't looking at any flying seabirds here at all, but we did also make a distinction between those birds that are obviously sitting at the shore preening and just floating about and not actively foraging. We didn't have those in the analysis. We just used birds that were very obviously foraging and diving. And basically, with the observers, we use what's typically called the European seabirds at sea methodologies, where you have 2 observers each looking on each side of the boat at different distances out from the boat, looking at the number of birds foraging. And so therefore, we could estimate quite accurately within less than several hundred meters. In fact, we could we'll say it's under 300 meters, we can estimate where the birds actually were at that point in time to the minute, and then go back and look at our other variables. So, to introduce you to the birds, we have these 4 diving species. They have quite different behaviors, and there's quite big differences in their ecology. First of all, the cute puffins, the Atlantic puffins, they are generally feeding within the water column, not tending to go down to the bottom, but seem to be diving rather shallow in this area. They're only present in May. They come in, they're tourists. They just come in and feed in May and during the summer, and then they're gone again. They do not stay during the winter. Another tourist is the common guillemot, which again is feeding pretty much pelagically within the water column. Again, this is a bird that is coming here only in May. It's not in our October surveys. And to mention then, the size of the bubble over on the left-hand side is the number of birds seen foraging along our transect lines. And now we introduce you to the local residents, is the black guillemot, and this bird tends to go down to the bottom and feed on the seabed almost exclusively. This bird lives in this area throughout, and so is present in the surveys both in May and October. The shag is our 4th species, the European shag, and again, it's something that dives down to the seabed, and again, is present in both seasons and lives here year-round, but some birds do come in here at winter, so you tend to have more birds in the winter than the summer. Okay, so what we've done statistically, we've used general linear mixed effect models, and our response variables have been the seabird abundances in the different seasons, and our environmental variables, which are our explanatory variables, have been then the speed of the tide, the level of turbulence, upward current, so the amount of upwelling or downwelling, and then seabed roughness and hardness. We used random variables to deal with any time issues, and then we've run the models with Poisson distributions, as these are count data, and model selection has been using only highly significant variables, so our p-value is set at 0.001 as far as I remember. And used our predictions then to look at predictions. So, outputs. Basically, I'll walk you through this. Essentially, what's written at the top are the general outputs that you do see variations in the associations between species. So actually, there are big differences in where these species forage in this area. But also within species, you see seasonal variations. So to start with down here then, what you see is our residents. Those are benthic foragers that dive down to the bottom. If you look over at the substrate, what you see is they basically, substrate comes out as a very significant factor in predicting where they are. They are tending to use quite different speeds, and as you can see, that the black guillemot actually changes what it does between the winter and the summer. In the summer, it's associated with a negative, i.e. slower speeds, and in the winter, it's associated with its foraging with faster speeds. And again, you see differences then in whether it's in a downwelling site in the summer versus the winter, and you'll see more about this in a So when we look at our summer residents and look at differences between birds that are pelagic versus demersal feeding, what you see is that there's quite a difference then with these two species that are quite similar in terms of that one is targeting the positive speed, increased speeds in the tide, and the other one negative, and that there's nothing else. There's nothing else that comes up as influencing the common guillemot's foraging locations. So definitely our residents are dealing something to do with the bottom, and definitely our summer residents that come in, our summer visitors that come in are dealing with speeds, and they both seem to like it fast. Faster speeds are when you see these animals foraging, more likely to forage. So to show you this spatially, we'll start with the Atlantic puffin, and you're only going to see data here in the summer. So what you're seeing in each of these panels is the color will be here in this time the speed of the tide. And what you're seeing is on your left your flood tides, on your right your ebb tides, and then the difference between neap and spring. And what's quite interesting is that, and the black lines then indicate within inside of these black lines is where turbines would be located. This is the areas where you have greater than 2 meters per second tides. And outside these areas are the slower tidal speeds than that, so most likely not where you're going to site tidal turbines. So what it's showing you is that basically during ebb tides is when this animal likes to feed more likely, and that it really likes the fastest water of the spring tides. And that's where you'll find it very much overlapping, very high spatial overlap with the areas where tidal turbines will be located. The other visitor is quite similar in that sense, that it also seems to increase with speed. It also seems to like the fastest speeds and is also going to overlap quite a lot with tidal turbine area. However, our resident species, now here we'll just look at the summer data first. What it's showing is actually there's just a few spots in the summer that it actually likes to feed in all the time. And these tend to be away from where the tidal turbine sites would be. So in summertime, you see really low spatial overlap. But what's very intriguing is this next one, is this is the same species, and probably the same animals, actually, they live there, in the winter, shows that they do move into an area, actually, up here in the top, that they seem to really prefer, whether it be flood or ebb, neap or spring. This seems to be their preferred area. So in the winter, they seem to come in and use this area. So there's some interesting possible reasons for that between species possibly competing with each other for areas of foraging in the summer but not in the winter. For our European shag, again, good news in the sense that it tends to forage, again, not within the areas where the turbines are. And again, there are these certain areas that really come up as its favorite sites to forage in. And its winter distribution isn't that different, actually. There just tends to be more of them around in the winter, as I've said. But they tend to basically stay out of the areas that are the highest of speeds in the region. So to conclude with this, what you see is there's really differences in the associations among species and within species, over time, that basically your summer resident has a high spatial overlap, your Atlantic puffin. The same with your common guillemot, you have this high spatial overlap. So there's these interesting ecological explanations to look at this possible resource competition that the common guillemot and the Atlantic puffin feeding in these high speed areas actually are either out competing or for whatever reason pushing the black guillemots then decide not to feed in these areas in the summer. But for our European shags, actually, they seem to always have the lowest of the spatial overlap, which is good news because they tend to be in almost all the areas where we plan to put tidal turbines. So we're hoping that these studies then are coming up with very quantitative measures that will enable us to predict the spatial overlaps at the population level so that we can go on to look at the potential population levels of any collision risk at these areas. And again, this project, huge numbers of people have been helped in this in terms of collecting the data from Marine Scotland with the Marine Lab cruises and seabird observations of JNCC trained people and all kinds of other people who have been helping us with this. And also Open Hydro is a case partner in this particular study, so we'd like to thank Sue Barr there as well. Okay, and I think that's the end for us.
Great. Thank you so much, Beth, and thank you to all the presenters for the great presentations today. And so we have a couple questions, and I think we have about 20 minutes, so if you guys do have other questions, please feel free to post them now, but we will just go ahead and start. The first question is for Ben. Your first slide shows what appears to be a cetacean swimming by the piles of the open hydro turbine at EMEC. Is this photoshopped or real?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay, yes, it's a real picture, I'm afraid. It wasn't photoshopped, it was, we were in the EMEC site and a group of killer whales swam through the site, and this one hung around and swam around the piles for enough time for us to saunter over and get those photographs. What it was doing around the piles, not quite sure, but it was certainly in and amongst them.
Interesting. And can you talk just a little bit more about just what other kinds of marine mammals you see around this area?
Probably not. I've not spent an awful lot of time, but maybe Beth can say more, because she's been up and down through the Fall of Warness site many times.
We have seen them all, I think. Basking sharks. I've myself seen some fantastically fast-going 2 male killer whales coming through at between 6 and 7 knots. They were amazing. Yeah, pretty much the seals are there, both gray and common. Porpoises are seen around the area. I can't say. I think there has been some sightings by our observer, at least in the calmer areas. So I would say that it'd be hard to say what hasn't been there.
Okay, thanks, Beth. Ben, one other question for you. Can you explain a little bit more on the counter rate model?
Right. There are several different varieties, and they have nuances of difference between them. The main issue, or the main thing to know, is they are. It's looking in a probabilistic sense about the animal and the blade sharing the same space and time as each other. So if you have a blade turning through the water, what's the chance of them two coinciding in space and time? So it really gives you an idea of how frequently these behaviors may, or these interactions may occur. They're not so much looking at how an animal may perceive a turbine and move around it. It's really just looking at the probability of co-occurrence. They've different nuances, but incorporate things like swim speed of the animal. The Bob Batty's model looks at what orientation the animal's in the water. They can be weighted by how much time animals spend in that part of the water column, so it's effectively looking at density and so on. And they get used for different amounts, so it's very tempting to take them and take the numbers at face value and then query them down to the decimal points and so on. But really, I think for me they're useful as an indication of how frequently these might occur in kind of broad terms, because obviously animals will respond to the turbine at some range in some way. It's unlikely that they're going to be completely oblivious, but it gives us an idea, a measure of how frequently these events might occur, and therefore how to consider the collision response to that particular local population of animals or otherwise. So from some of the early modeling work we did, this is a long time ago, but it came out with a number like about 13. It was porpoises per tidal turbine for a large array. So it's 13 per turbine per year, and if you multiplied that up by many, many turbines, it comes to a number to take note of, a quite large number. But in terms of monitoring, 13 is about 1 a month, so you're looking for something, quite a rare signal. So I think it's a very useful measure to just give us an idea about how frequent these events are. But obviously there's a whole level of animal behavior to superimpose, and as we learn more, we'll be able to tweak these numbers a bit better.
Okay. Thank you, Ben. So the next question is for Benjamin. The operating frequencies of the EK60ES appears to be within the hearing detection range of marine mammals and fish. Is there a potential for this to affect the accuracy of the data collected by the flowback system?
Yeah, so I agree that we need to be very careful of the frequencies that we're using. In terms of wider avoidance of the site, because of the low power of these systems, and because they're on the seabed facing vertically upwards towards the water surface, the sound energy quickly decays back to background levels after just one or two bounces off the sea surface and seabed. So in terms of wider avoidance, I don't think we're having a particularly big effect. In terms of evasion, the closer scale behavioral changes within the range of the acoustics, yeah, potentially there is the risk of behavioral effects there. And so that's where we see this complement of either using the different frequencies in tandem or coupling this with other methods such as passive acoustics and optical cameras for periods to try and understand what the animals are doing, so that then we can try and extrapolate for the periods when we don't have specific frequencies on.
Okay, great. Thanks, Benjamin. Another question about the flowback device. Is it influenced by tidal turbulence in rapid flows? And is it affect the detection of organisms at high tidal flows?
Yeah, so it's a good question and a really important consideration for these sites. One of the reasons for putting it on a self-contained platform that we can move back 10, 20, 30 meters from the tidal turbine structure is to get the acoustic instruments out of the immediate wake of the tidal turbine structure. So we've seen from some of the other approaches where the acoustic instruments are actually mounted on the piling itself, that they can quickly become, the detection probabilities very much reduced from the wake effect. So we can avoid that to some extent by moving it out of the wake. For the multi-beam, we're accepting a lower sensitivity with that instrument, but no, from the results that we've seen so far, we don't see any kind of masking, any kind of reduced detection, even at the highest tidal flows at the EMEX site, so up to about 8 or 9 knots. For the EK60, what we see at the EMEX site certainly is that, yeah, at the high tidal flows and at the high periods of turbulence, or particularly sea surface roughness, which we're picking up with the shore-based radar, yeah, we see these subsurface boils coming through, so extending from the sea surface right down through the water column, sometimes almost towards the seabed at the highest flows. So that, yes, it certainly masks targets in the water column, but we're finding with the multi-beam, we can still use that for detection of the targets. And actually, it's measures with this morphology of turbulence and the subsurface boils that we're finding that the animals, the birds particularly, are using for foraging, using these features. So it does mask some of the detections, but we can work around it, and it's actually a useful measure in itself.
Great, thank you, Benjamin. And so you also mentioned the potential for using cameras in low visibility areas for fine-scale species behavioral information. How would these cameras work in low visibility environments, and are you proposing to use additional lighting in these cases?
So the cameras, we're at quite an exciting stage where we're looking at the possibilities. We're talking quite closely with Brian Pelagi and colleagues at the University of Washington, who's got an awful lot of experience with using cameras in these tidal energy sites. So here, I guess the choice is either using illumination, if you're worried about daylight or low light levels at depth, or mounting the cameras on the tidal turbine structure itself. So if you've got a low visibility range, trying to get them as close as possible to the rotor-swept area to try and see just the final few meters. So it's a little bit about camera placement, a little bit about illumination, and potentially accepting any behavioral effects from that. I would guess it would be very much site-specific, and but I'm afraid I have to defer the question to colleagues who know a little bit more about the cameras.
Okay. Thank you, Benjamin. And so you did mention that schools of fish were observed around the flowback system. Is there a tendency to see these schools in specific tides or times?
Yeah, we're still at quite an early stage of the analysis, but we're seeing trends with speed of tide by target categories, by time of day as well, and also from the slide that hopefully you saw in Beth's presentation, with this very bidirectional flow, the flood and ebb from the north-south. We're seeing actually a change in distribution of fish between where the water is coming from. So we see, just in preliminary analysis, a big increase in the chlorophyll and the phytoplankton, an increase in the fish, which hopefully will be able to link up to the birds and potentially marine mammal foraging behavior in these sites.
Great, thank you. And one last question, how broadly available is the flowback monitoring platform, could you also say a word about the deployment and operating costs?
So if I take deployment and operating costs, first of all, in terms of servicing and operating costs, it's very low. The batteries are built, the whole frame is built to be reused many times over. In terms of deployment and recovery costs, it's very much site dependent. So at the EMEC site, we can deploy in about a 20-minute stack side window, and we can recover in about a 1 hour stack side period. So recovery is deployments with a single boat. Recovery, you've got a couple of options. The most successful one for a tidal site is deploying an ROV down to hook onto the frame and then lifting the frame up that way. But also you can put a seabed line to a clump weight far enough away that it won't affect your species of interest or your acoustic measurements, and have a surface recovery buoy. So the reason why it's site dependent is that we're very lucky at EMEC that we're very close to a well-equipped port with a lot of well-equipped vessels. So it's very much down to how can you get your vessels to the site, what's the mobilization costs, but it's designed around about an hour of operation. In terms of capital costs, the flowback frame itself was built as a prototype, and so the costs are quite high. The thing that we're trying to look at there is whether we can use the whole suite of information to try and reduce down to a reduced monitoring package. So taking all the information we're gathering from the UK60 and then trying to operate later without the UK60, just with the multi-beam, but using the ground truthing that we've already performed from that. In terms of the multi-beam, the actual instrument head itself is of the order of about 25, so about $40,000 US. The UK60 is up to more like a few £100,000. So that's why we're trying to get away eventually from the higher power. Uses about 3 times the battery power, and it's a lot more like 10 times the cost for the UK60. So the capital cost for the first one-off platform is high, but we're looking at a reduced monitoring platform in future.
Thank you, Benjamin. Question for Beth. How far out at sea were the seabird surveys conducted, and can you talk a little bit more about potential specific location for marine energy devices?
Okay, sorry, yeah, the scale on that, basically it's about a 3 to 4 kilometer long channel that we're in, and about a 2.5 kilometer wide channel. So we were bouncing back, the V-shaped zigzag survey that I was showing basically was we would get within about 300 meters or so of the land base as we change direction. So I'm not quite sure what's the what more in the question that they want to know about how many times or how far away from, because there is a tiny little island, but they're all small islands up there. There's no big bit of land anywhere nearby.
Yeah, what are the limits, like the furthest and the nearest distances from land that birds were observed?
Well, on the boat, we were doing all the observations from the boat, so we never counted animals more than 300 meters away. There were different observations on land run by the EMEC group, and those observers that stand on land could be up to 2.5 kilometers away. But if you're talking about our own observers that looked at our flowback mooring positions and stuff, they were under 2 kilometers. Usually 1.5 kilometer was the biggest distance that we'd have our observer from the flowback mooring positions.
Okay, great. Thanks, Beth. And do you think or know if the difference in seasonal geographic overlap with black guillemots may be due to seasonal dietary needs, such as breeding season versus non-breeding, where the target species in breeding seasons are in the lower current, lower turbulence areas?
It's a good question. No, we don't know. We see them targeting, the species often seen in their mouths in the winter and the summer is a butterfish. So no, I wish I knew. I wish we knew more about their prey species and what they look at. It would be lovely to do some colony type work and look at diet being brought back in, since these birds live locally. But unfortunately, they love cliffs. It's very difficult areas to actually get observations from. But yeah, some form of dietary lookout would be fantastic to help this.
Yeah, great. Thank you, Beth. And just a wrap-up question for all the presenters. In your opinion, is there generally more marine animal activity transiting and foraging during low flow periods versus high flow periods?
Well, so I can jump in and say for the birds, it's quite obvious it's very high speeds that animals are using. And I think what we've seen, Benjamin, with the fish.
Yeah, I think what we're finding is that the fish match up quite nicely with the birds. Yeah, we can pick up the prey that the birds are feeding on with the underwater acoustics. And yeah, it's looking like it matches quite nicely.
I'll just say on the marine mammals, it's too early to tell, and varies between different sites. Some sites we see lots of marine mammal activity at specific times of the tide and at specific times of the year. Harbour seals and coral ray is a new and quite exciting example, where the animals seem to be targeting that area for probably reasons of foraging. Other sites that seem to be moving through with the flood tide moving through an area and less interest on the ebb tide. So it varies, probably because these predators are exploiting chinks in the armor of the fish prey. But we'll find out as time goes on.
Great. Thank you all for answering that. And with that, it looks like we don't have any more questions. But I'd like to thank all of the presenters for presenting today. Very interesting work, and thank you all for attending the webinar. I'd like